In August 1947, as the sun set over the Indian subcontinent, the world witnessed one of the largest human migrations in history. More than 14 million people crossed borders that hadn't existed the day before, borders drawn hastily on colonial maps by men who would soon leave forever. It was meant to mark the birth of two nations, India and Pakistan. Instead, it unleashed chaos. Entire trains arrived full of corpses. Rivers ran red. Neighbors turned on each other. And the dream of freedom, that had inspired millions for decades, became a nightmare. The Partition of India wasn't just a political act. It was an amputation, a surgical separation of history, identity, and land, one that has never truly healed. Welcome to Roots of the Matter. In this edition, we uncover how imperial haste, religious nationalism, and political miscalculations combine to create the unresolved conflict between India and Pakistan in Kashmir, igniting one of the bloodiest and most traumatic events in human history. Thanks for joining us. Now let's get started. To understand the tragedy of partition, we have to go back, not to 1947, but to 1857. The Indian Rebellion of that year, called the First War of Independence by some, and the Sepoy Mutiny by the British, marked the beginning of the end for the old Mughal order. After brutally crushing the uprising, the British Crown took direct control over India. From then on, divide and rule became policy. The British understood that India's strength lay in its diversity, in its thousands of communities, faiths, and languages. And so they exploited those differences. Census categories hardened. Religious identities that had coexisted for centuries were turned into political blocs. By the late 19th century, nationalism was stirring, but not one nationalism. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, spoke the language of unity and self-rule. But as the movement grew, many Muslims began to fear that Swaraj, self-rule, would mean Hindu domination. In 1906, the All India Muslim League was born, first as a voice for Muslim concerns within India, but eventually as the voice of a separate homeland. Still, independence from British rule remained the shared goal, until the dream itself began to fracture. The word Pakistan first appeared in 1933 in a student pamphlet at Cambridge. It meant Land of the Pure, an acronym of Punjab, Afghania, Kashmir, Sindh, and Baluchistan. But the man who would make it political reality, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, didn't start as a separatist. Jinnah was once called the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. He worked alongside Gandhi and Nehru in the freedom struggle. He believed India could be a secular democracy protecting all communities. But by the late 1930s, that faith began to break. The Congress Party's growing dominance after the 1937 provincial elections left the Muslim League marginalized. Many Muslims feared that independence under Congress would simply replace British rulers with Hindu ones. And then came the war. During World War II, Britain dragged India into the conflict without consultation. Congress leaders resigned in protest. Jinnah's Muslim League supported the British war effort and used the moment to strengthen its bargaining position. By 1940, at the League's conference in Lahore, Jinnah declared that Muslims were a nation and that they must have their own homeland. The two-nation theory was born. It was a demand that would change the map of the world and unleash a storm no one could control. After World War II, Britain was exhausted, bankrupt, battered. India was no longer governable from London. In 1947, the new British Prime Minister Clement Attlee announced that power would be transferred by June 1948. But India's last viceroy, Lord Louis Mountbatten, decided to move that deadline forward to August 1947. It was a rush. A hurried exit from an empire collapsing under its own contradictions. To draw the borders of the new nations, they brought in a man who had never been to India before, Cyril Radcliffe, a British lawyer. He was given 5 weeks to divide 175,000 square miles and 88 million people. 5 weeks to decide who would wake up in India and who would wake up in Pakistan. He had no maps showing villages by religion, no time to visit the land he was cutting in half, so he drew lines on paper, and walked away. Those lines would run through homes, fields, and hearts, and set off one of the largest migrations in human history. When midnight struck on August 15, 1947, fireworks lit the sky in Delhi. Nehru spoke of India's tryst with destiny. Crowds danced in Karachi. Flags rose in Lahore. But across the borderlands, especially in Punjab and Bengal, the celebration was drowned in screams. Entire villages disappeared overnight. Caravans of refugees stretched as far as the eye could see, 14 million people on the move. Hindus and Sikhs fled from what was now Pakistan. Muslims fled from what was now India. Trains meant to carry families to safety often arrived at their destination full of corpses. In the chaos, over 1 million people were killed. Some say many more. Women were abducted, assaulted, mutilated. Neighbors who once shared meals turned against each other with unspeakable fury. There was no single plan, no coordinated ethnic cleansing. It was an explosion of fear, revenge, and loss, a collective trauma that neither side has fully confronted. And while the British left behind the language of democracy and law, they also left behind the hatred they had nurtured, now without a referee. When the dust settled, India and Pakistan were two nations, but their boundaries were far from settled. The most dangerous fault line was the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, ruled by a Hindu Maharaja over a majority Muslim population. In October 1947, tribal fighters from Pakistan invaded Kashmir, claiming to liberate it for Islam. The Maharaja, desperate for help, signed the instrument of accession to India. India sent in troops. Pakistan responded. The first war between the two newborn nations had begun, within months of independence. The war ended in 1949 with a UN-brokered ceasefire, dividing Kashmir into two, a line of control that still bleeds today. Since then, India and Pakistan have fought 3 more wars, countless skirmishes, and a decades-long insurgency in Kashmir. Every generation since 1947 has inherited the same conflict, replayed through different names, ideologies, and technologies. It's why, more than 70 years later, the partition still feels unfinished. For decades, both nations tried to build new identities out of the ashes of partition. In India, the leaders of the Congress Party sought to create a secular democracy, one that belonged to all faiths. Yet communal wounds ran deep, surfacing in riots, pogroms, and a politics of identity that never truly disappeared. In Pakistan, founded in the name of Islam, the challenge was different, defining what kind of Islamic state it was meant to be. Democracy faltered. Military rule intervened. The idea of Pakistan, meant to unite Muslims itself, fractured into ethnic and linguistic lines. In Bangladesh, the 1971 War of Independence was another echo of partition, a second amputation of the original dream. And throughout the diaspora, in Britain, in Canada, in East Africa, families carried the memories of a homeland divided by a line they never drew. To this day, survivors of partition recall the smell of burning homes, the sound of distant gunfire, and the faces of those they left behind. Many never spoke of it, because the pain was too great. It's tempting to see partition as an inevitable clash between Hindus and Muslims. But history tells a more complex story. The British Empire, weakened but determined to protect its strategic interests, engineered a quick exit, one that prioritized speed over stability. Mountbatten's rush to meet an arbitrary date left no time for orderly transition. The Radcliffe Line was finalized just days before independence and kept secret until after the celebrations. Even Churchill, watching from afar, saw the collapse as vindication of his belief that Indians couldn't govern themselves. Yet this chaos wasn't destiny. It was the product of cynical political calculation by imperial administrators, nationalist leaders, and religious extremists alike. The British, eager to wash their hands of empire, left behind a subcontinent in flames. And India and Pakistan, both victims and participants in that tragedy, have carried that fire ever since. The partition didn't just divide land. It divided memory and truth itself. In school textbooks, each nation tells its own story. In Pakistan, partition is portrayed as a triumph, the creation of a homeland for a persecuted people. In India, it's remembered as a tragedy, a wound inflicted by colonialism and religious division. Yet both nations have built their identities around that moment of rupture. Over time, the rivalry became institutionalized through armies, borders, and ideologies. In 1974, India tested its first nuclear device. In 1998, Pakistan followed. Today, both nations possess more than 100 nuclear warheads, two mirror images locked in a security dilemma born in 1947. The Kashmir conflict remains the flashpoint. A single skirmish there can bring the world to the brink. But beneath the geopolitics lies something deeper, the human inability to let go of history. For both nations, partition is not just a past event. It's an ongoing story of fear, pride, and belonging, one that shapes everything from elections to art to diplomacy. Look closely, and you'll see that partition never really ended. It simply evolved. In India, the rise of Hindu nationalism has revived debates about identity that the founders hoped to bury. The Citizenship Amendment Act, the rhetoric of love jihad, and the exclusionary politics of belonging all echo that same old fear of the other. In Pakistan, the struggle to balance faith and governance continues. The idea of Islam as a unifying force has often been used by elites to suppress dissent, while radical groups exploit it to challenge the state itself. Across the border, in Kashmir, new generations grow up under curfew and surveillance, caught between two nations still fighting over a promise made in 1947. And for the millions of people who still cross borders, as workers, refugees, or migrants, partition remains a living reality. The ghosts of that summer in 1947 still haunt South Asia's politics, its culture, and its imagination. In recent years, historians and artists have begun to revisit partition through films, oral histories, and digital archives. For decades, the survivors' voices were silenced. But now, their memories are being preserved. Fragments of lives uprooted, captured before they fade. Listening to them changes how we see history. Partition wasn't just a line on a map. It was millions of personal apocalypses, each with its own rhythm of loss. A missing brother, a vanished village, a photograph left behind in a burning home. And yet, amid the horror, there were also stories of compassion. Sikhs sheltering Muslims, Muslims saving Hindu families, strangers risking everything to protect one another. Those stories remind us that partition was not only about hatred, it was about humanity pushed to its limits. The partition of India was meant to solve a problem, to give peace through separation. Instead, it created a permanent frontier of suspicion. For nearly 8 decades, India and Pakistan have lived as uneasy neighbors, bound by shared history, divided by inherited trauma. The soldiers at the Wagah border lower their flags in a daily ritual of defiance and pride. But on both sides, families still whisper stories of the places their grandparents once called home. Partition didn't just divide territory. It divided memory. It divided hope. And yet, to understand the present, from nuclear standoffs to nationalist politics, we have to trace their roots back to that summer of 1947, because the war that began with the partition of India never truly ended. That's it on this edition of Roots of the Matter. History doesn't end when the borders close. Sometimes that's when it begins. So, what do you think the partition of India teaches us about nationalism, identity, and empire? Share your thoughts in the comments section. And if you value deep history explained clearly, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Why not watch the next video in this series? Versailles, the peace that made another war.